You are listening to the Dark Fantastic Podcast.
Welcome to this new episode of the Dark Fantastic Podcast. I'm your host, AK, and I've got some great things lined up for you on this episode. So stay tuned and let's begin.
Summer 1990. A teenage boy in trouble. An evil that only comes out at night. Only a straight-to VHS movie can save him. From A. Kale, the author of Beware the Night. Bad Dreams. A thrilling horror novel, now available on Amazon. Rated PG-13, for some thematic elements and mild violence.
My guest on this episode is a New York Times best-selling author. He is the co-author with Stephen King of the best-selling novella Gwendy's Button Box, and he is the founder-publisher of Cemetery Dance magazine and the Cemetery Dance Publications book imprint. He is also the creator and writer of the online website Stephen King Revisited, a wonderful site for King fans. His latest book is the suspense novel Chasing the Boogeyman, out now. Please welcome Richard Chizmar. So to start with, which is something that's always fascinating to me, which is knowing which books made you fall in love with reading and writing as a kid.
Oh boy, as a kid, I grew up in a family of with four older siblings. So I was surrounded by books, and both my mother and father were big readers. Excuse me. So there were books all around the house, and regular trips to the library were a big deal. I was one of the fortunate ones to just be surrounded by books, and from a really early age, reading was a big part of my life. As far as the specific titles, I mean, as a really young kid, all the Dr. Seuss books, of course, and then, the Wizard of Oz and anything I could get my hands on. And then as I grew up, I started just reading anything I could find, the Alfred Hitchcock mystery and anthologies. And my father was a big paperback reader, so I read a lot of the pulps early on, John MacDonald and some of the crime writers, but I read anything. I mean, I would steal my sister's Sidney Sheldon books and read those, when I was way too young to understand half of the things that were happening.
Yeah, you mentioned John MacDonald, and who you actually mentioned in one of your stories, one of the stories that I enjoyed very much in Long December.
Mm-hmm.
It was called Last Words, with the grandfather, I think, left the John MacDonald the paperbacks for his grandkids to find in the treasure hunt. So
right.
Obviously, you're a fan.
Yeah, a lot of good memories of those books, and it just, my father, like I said, he was a big paperback reader. So he loved the paperback swap section in the library, where you could bring in your books and put them on the shelf and take, a like number of books away. And he just tore through paperbacks like that. And I remember I wrote a story called Heroes that said, I kind of grew up seeing the top half of my father's face over a paperback book. And it's pretty accurate. He would take my friends and me fishing and, out to the ball fields, and he would sit in the car, or he'd sit out on the grass or a bench and read a book while we did our thing. And then he would drive us home. So yeah, definitely a lot of affection there.
You're also the editor of a number of anthologies, including one of my favorites, which is October Dreams, and in layman's terms, which is a tribute to Richard Lehman, as well as the Shivers series. a lot of anthologies, which I didn't know about. I only knew your work as a writer, but I discovered your anthologies a bit later.
It's interesting.
And
I was going to say it's usually the opposite. People found me through the editorial side of things, and then they find out, hey, the guy actually writes some too. So I like that you did it the opposite way. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I think it was Widow's Point. I think the first time I came across your work, and then there was the Stephen King collaborations, which I actually haven't read. Because I read just your solo work, and but speaking of the anthologies, which are actually very, very enjoyable, as I said, October Dreams is great. It has a great cover as well. So, what do you enjoy most about editing anthologies?
It's it's interesting because each one is different, and I know that sounds awfully cliche to say, but it's true. Now, an anthology like October Dreams was I was going to say was a dream, pun not intended. But what I like about anthologies are just seeing the even when it has a fairly focused theme. Like I did a book called The Earth Strikes Back, which was ecological horror stories. And it's always a joy to see the wide range of stories that come in and how different authors interpret, the theme that you hand them to write a story, about. So that's part of it. And then just working with a bunch of different writers, it's like working on an issue of the magazine, but much more focused. And then the details, deciding how to position the stories, which story goes where in the book. You're trying to design a specific reading experience for the reader. So you're looking at, length of stories, pacing of stories, the theme, obviously the specific theme of each story, and kind of how they play off each other. I guess I am not musically inclined, but I assume it's fairly similar to how a musician assembles an album, or a DVD, or a CD rather. You can tell I'm giving away my age here, but yeah, there's and then a book like October Dreams, like I said, where Halloween has always been really close to my heart, and my co-editor on that one, Bob Morris, and we had a blast doing it. Just seeing being able to mix our favorite reprints, classic stories by Ray Bradbury and some of the others, with brand new stories from such a great, contributor list. And then my favorite in that book was, just seeing all the really personal Halloween memories come in. So yeah, that one's at the top of my list. But yeah, anthologies are always interesting, and they're much more fun when you're the publisher and the editor, so you have complete control, as opposed to you've sold an anthology to a different publisher, and then there's specific pressures that come in hand.
Yeah. I know I'm asking you about anthologies because as an avid reader, and of course you can tell that I love horror, I love dark fantasy, but they are usually a very, they are a mixed bunch. You don't know when you're buying or borrowing an anthology what you're gonna get, because of course there are the big names. Usually you can guarantee those, but many of them depend on the editor.
Right.
So going into an anthology, for me personally, I usually, there are the go-to guys like Martin Greenberg, for example. The big names.
Right.
And they are big names because they are reliable.
Yeah, they've always delivered. So absolutely.
Yeah. So I think now to me you are one of those, because I've read some of your anthologies and none of them disappoint. None of them have disappointed me so far. So that's that's great. So because I rarely find someone who's a full-time writer who writes novels and short stories and as dedicated as you are to writing, who's also an editor. Maybe the only person I can remember, I'm also a big fan of his, was the late great Charles Grant.
What I always felt interesting about anthologies is, and again, I'm going to compare them to albums and musicians, is, you know, if you're a musician and you put out an album, or you put out a CD now, or you put out the, you know, whatever they're called online, and, you know, you have 12 or 10, 12, 14 songs on there. And if 2 of them hit, the album is considered a success. And this is one of the things that's always I've been amused by with anthologies, is because if you put out an anthology and it has 20 stories and people hate 10 of those stories, you can't help but feel like a failure as the editor who assembled them. It's just interesting because you have to have such a much higher batting average to succeed in anthologies than you do in albums. And I've always thought that was interesting. You know, you have 1 or 2 hits on an album and hey, it's a big success, where if you only have 1 or 2 good stories in an anthology, you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Because, you know, the short story form in general isn't as popular as it used to be. But so you have that going against you, you know,
Yes.
with the reader. With not I don't know if it's the typical reader, but I think young readers, the you know, the younger generations aren't really used to the short story form. People want, you know, to invest their time in a longer piece of work. And I think Stephen King, I'm a big fan of Stephen King's, but he's to blame for that, I think, because his you know, his greatest novels, I think, are the big, you know, huge, the big huge ones, you know.
Right.
Yeah, especially in the dark fantasy horror genre, he introduced that. I don't think there was any writer before King who actually wrote, you know, these big literary horror novels that are like The Stand, 1,000 pages, and it. And but anyway, I get your point about anthologies, and I have, you know, a love-hate relationship with anthologies because I've been burnt so many times. But your work is great, and I highly recommend it to listeners, because, as you said, I think younger readers and new readers, I think, maybe don't know about your editing work. Maybe most of young readers now, or new readers, know you from especially your latest novel, Chasing the Boogeyman.
Right.
Which I liked very, very much. I thought it was, you know, it was very, very deserving of the hype, which is unusual, because lately a lot of novels that have been hyped, I have to say, have been very disappointing across all genres, not just the horror genre, but your novel was very, very, you know, buzzed about. It was very, very hyped, but it really deserves it. I'm not saying that, you know, as a compliment or anything, but it really is something special. And I started to get a bit bored with horror, to be honest.
Right.
In the last maybe 5 years or so. But Chasing the Boogeyman was really, really a breath of fresh air. Just I've never read anything like it. It's just so heartfelt and scary, of course. But I think the warmth of the voice, of your voice, and the way you approach the story, which isn't really, you know, it isn't really original, the idea of a serial killer in a small town.
Oh,
so
not at all. I mean, that's the funny thing I was going to say is it's really just an old-fashioned campfire story, you know, about a small town, which we've all heard 100 times before. So I appreciate all the kind words you just said. And when you said I'd never read anything like it, you know, fortunately I've heard that a lot. And I always kind of have to smile because of what I just said. You know, it's a very traditional, old-fashioned story. But the way I chose to tell it was, and again, I don't even give myself the credit for that because it just happened. It felt like that was the only way I knew how to tell the story. If I told Chasing the Boogeyman from the viewpoint of an imaginary narrator, I think it would have been a pretty boring book, and it would have been there, done that for most readers. But the fact that the story that I felt so strongly that it needed to be told from my viewpoint, back in time when when I was much younger and much more bright-eyed about the whole world, and it became this loss of innocence story, and I was able to include my friends and my family, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot of heart in the book, which again, you know, I'd love to take credit for, but again, it just felt like that's the way the story needed to be told. It needed to be told from this very intimate place. And I ended up being a love letter to my family and friends in my hometown, which happened to have a serial killer.
Yeah, it shows, and it shows this heartfelt vibe shows up in most of your work, which takes me to my next question, which is your style, or as Stephen King calls it, your voice, basically. Because a lot of writers of dark fantasy, horror, and speculative fiction, mainly of the old generation, seem to be influenced by the same writers, mainly King, Peter Straub, and maybe Ray Bradbury to some extent, to name but a few. And as a result of that, many of them, I don't know how to put this, but they don't really have that unique of a voice, to be honest. But you do have your own voice. It's very personal, and as I said, it's very heartfelt, without being mawkish. And it's also, many of your stories are very, very dark, but for the most part they aren't nihilistic, which seems to be, I don't want to say popular, but it seems to be, a lot of writers now are very nihilistic, especially when it comes to horror and dark fantasy, and across all genres. I think it's in the past 10 years or more, which is something I'm not really a fan of. I'm not really a fan of nihilism. I read, novels that are very bleak and very dark, and I appreciate them, and some of them I love. For example, I love the Long Walk by Stephen King, which is you can't get any darker than that.
You cannot.
But but the overbearing nihilism of horror in the past 10 years is missing from your work. Thankfully, your work is, again, as I said, some of your stories are very dark. A father who learns something terrible about his dead son, and stuff like that, and discovering terrible secrets. A mother discovers a terrible secret about her, I don't want to give it away, but about one of her children, by snooping into their room and finding something terrible inside the shoebox. And it's very, very dark stuff. But again, there is always this warmth and heartfelt vibe in your work, and it's a very singular voice. So what do you think helped you shape that voice when so many other writers of your generation and many generations in the genre of horror or dark fantasy or suspense, they don't really get there?
My two biggest influences are Stephen King and Ed Gorman. And Stephen King, I read from a very early age, Salem's Lot, and went on from there. And he absolutely, without Stephen King, I would not have started Cemetery Dance. I would have not have started writing in the horror, suspense, crime, thriller genres. There's just no question of that. I like to tell people I grew up with a Stephen King paperback in my back pocket, pretty much, and it's accurate. But as a writer, in my 20s, particularly my early 20s, when I was just starting to sell stories and send them out, I was trying to reinvent the wheel. I was trying to write plot heavy stories that were twisty and super original. And like I said, I was trying to reinvent that wheel instead of just telling good, honest stories. And despite the fact that some of those stories sold, along with plenty of rejections, they're not very good stories. And I look back at those and I think, well, it's really simple. It's a really easy task to pinpoint why. And it's just because they weren't honest. I wasn't writing as myself. I was trying to write to sell. And I also discovered, fairly early, I'm not a real elaborate plotter. I'm just a storyteller. And I do rely on that voice of mine. But at some point in there, I discovered Ed Gorman, and I started reading particularly his crime fiction, and and a lot of his short fiction. And what Ed taught me without trying to teach me was just that if you wrote about things that were important to you, no matter how small they may seem in your own world, but you wrote about them honestly and with integrity and with heart. And this might not work for all people, but it worked for me. And what I found was that some of his stories weren't about a whole lot. They were about a retired hitman sitting on a bench in front of a bus stop who has a conversation with a single mom who he, finds out is on the run, from her own trouble in her past. And, an 8 or 9 page story like that with just sharp dialogue that poked you in the heart without kind of being like overly sentimental, but just honesty and warmth and heart mixed with the darkness. I think of a story of his like The Ugly File about the man who collected pictures of deformed children and just how dark of a story that is. But the way he wrote it's so humane, I guess is the word I'm stumbling and searching for. But he taught me to write about things that were important to me, no matter how small they may seem, whether it was a moment in time, a person, a place, a memory. It honestly, it changed everything for me because it gave me the confidence to write those kind of stories. Before that, I felt like nobody wants to read a Richard Chizmar story about, a woman standing at a phone booth holding the hand of a girl whose face is dirty and kind of, nobody wants to hear the story about that mom and child. But once I saw Ed and how he was able to accomplish what he was with particularly his short stories, but also his novels, it gave me the confidence to try to just be honest and write about what mattered to me. And once that happened, that's when I started to find my voice. And that's when readers actually started responding to the stories. So it's always a really easy thing for me to look back and say, Ed taught me that. Ed taught me you can be plain spoken. You can just be a pure storyteller. But as long as you're being honest and putting a little bit of heart and soul in there, you're gonna connect with some people. And I thanked him profusely over and over again. And typical Ed Gorman, he always kind of just shrugged it off and said, "Rich, you knew what you were doing from day one." And I point at those early stories and I say, "No, sir, I did not." So that's a long rambling answer, but I have such warm feelings towards Ed, not only as a friend, but as an influence and as a literary father to me.
Yeah, that's also what's so great about ebooks, I think, because for me, at least in the past 10 years, finding an Ed Gorman book was hard, especially the older titles, from the 80s and the stuff he wrote under the Daniel Ransom name. So these, ebook reprints are just heaven sent. So I think now his work is widely available, which is great.
Yeah, I agree. I'm looking at my shelves now and Ed Gorman's all over it. But yeah, a lot of these books, if you went out today and tried to buy them, your best bet would be, eBay or secondhand bookstores. So yeah, the ebooks are definitely saving, a lot of searching for people. And I try to sing Ed's praises as often as I can. So hopefully I've influenced a few readers to go out there and get them.
Yeah. So what are you working on now?
I'm working on a few short stories that I have promised to people, and I'm getting ready to start the next book, which I can't really talk much about, but hopefully I'll have that finished by early spring. And yeah, next year should be interesting. Chase, we have the third Gwyndy book comes out with Stephen King, comes out in February in hardcover. Then it comes out in June pretty quickly in trade paperback, and Chasing the Boogeyman comes out in July in trade paperback, and then I'll have a release in October, which is still a secret, but we should be announcing that sometime soon. So it'll be a busy year, and then hopefully 2023 we'll see the publication of the book that I'm about to start writing.
I look forward to all that, and I look forward to starting the trilogy you wrote with Stephen King. I know you wrote the first book with him and the last book with him, but the middle book you wrote alone, right?
I did, yeah. He was my editor on that, along with Ed Schlesinger at Simon and Schuster. But yeah, Ed was Steve was busy with one of the Holly Gibney books. I can't remember which one, but I just remember that was his thing. As he said, I'm going to be busy with Holly for the next few months, but you go ahead and write it and I'll edit it. So I couldn't pass that offer up, but yeah, we wrote Gwendy's Button Box together and didn't really think there'd be more to the story, but we both kind of fell in love with her and kept coming back to it. So I've just been nothing but a pleasure doing that. And I'm excited to see what people think of the third one.
Is it the final one?
It's the final in the trilogy. Let's just put it that way. But just like in his Dark Tower series, he ended up going back and writing The Wind in the Keyhole. I think there's the potential for some more Gwendy stories that take place in between books, that kind of thing. So I think we just both have to, with the second book, it was my idea, and I just emailed him and said, I just woke up and I feel like I know what Gwendy's been doing for the last 10 years. And I told him, and he said, that's terrific. You need to write that. And with the third one, he texted me one Sunday evening and said, I think I know what Gwendy's been doing. And that turned into the third book. So who knows when it might happen again.
That sounds great. And I really look forward to reading more of your books, and especially your short stories, because I love your short stories. As I said, I really enjoyed A Long December, and I highly recommend it to listeners who only know you from your novels and anthologies, because you only collected, I think, your short stories recently. I think it was a bit hard to find.
Oh yeah. There was before A Long December, there was a good 10-year gap before, and I was writing. I'd worked in the movie industry during a big chunk of that time, and just wasn't writing as many short stories. But that's when I kind of came back to the fold and really fell in love with writing prose again. And A Long December, assembling that kind of, was my re-entry publication. And collecting those stories was a lot of fun, and I left out the ones I didn't consider good. So it was nice to be able to just put all what I thought, the stories that I loved all in one place.
Edgewood, Maryland, small working class town. Friendly, peaceful, safe, until the summer of 1988. When the terrified residents are stalked like prey and held hostage by a madman. The newspapers called him the Boogeyman. I was there. This is my story.
What makes a book a hit? Is it the quality of the writing, or is it the readability of the prose? Or is it the originality of the plot? How many books does one come across in a lifetime of reading that could be called truly original? And what does originality mean exactly? Some of the world's best-selling authors across history haven't been very original. Charles Dickens, for example, one of the most popular writers of his time and who remains popular to this day, with many TV and film adaptations still being made from his books and stories, didn't really come up with story ideas that were very original. He basically dealt with such time-worn story ideas as rags to riches, the cruelty of man to his fellow man, the plight of the poor and the orphaned, and the horrors of the French Revolution. But it was his writing, his style, and his point of view that made his books special, made them relevant. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who along with Gaston Leroux and Edgar Allan Poe basically invented the mystery detective genre, was an inventive, energetic writer, and his plots were, for the most part, very original, unlike many of his contemporaries. He forayed into science fiction with The Lost World. He wrote some horror stories like The Mystery of Klumber and many other short stories like The Mummy Story, Lot 249, which has been adapted many times for film and television and is considered one of the most important and influential mummy stories ever written. He also ventured into fantasy with the Professor Challenger stories, including The Disintegration Machine and The Lost World, which I just mentioned. Modern best-selling authors don't really fare very well when it comes to originality. Stephen King, a brilliant storyteller and a good writer, is one of the most unoriginal authors to ever hit the bestseller lists. His plots are always undercooked, and he rarely brings anything new to the table when it comes to original ideas or original plots. No one could accuse Christine, Salem's Lot, Pet Sematary, or It of being original. Their plots are tired and often ludicrous. But again, the way he deals with the story, the way he draws his characters, and the way he uses his captivating voice to tell the tale make him one of the most popular writers in history. The same goes for J.K. Rowling, who borrows, sometimes very heavily, from every fantasy book ever written, especially Tolkien, Ursula Le Guin, and C.S. Lewis. And, of course, there is James Patterson, whose stories rarely showcase any originality. Yet Patterson's books have sold more than 300 million copies around the world, making him one of the most successful writers in history. So it's obvious that originality isn't a prerequisite to success as a writer. But again, what is originality? One of the most spellbinding and thought-provoking books I've come across recently is The Second Coming by Richard Marsh. Richard Marsh was a very popular author of the Victorian era. His most famous book is The Beetle, which was so successful to the extent that it outsold Bram Stoker's Dracula at the time. And having read The Beetle before I read The Second Coming, I went into The Second Coming with very low expectations because The Beetle was a very underwhelming book. It's not very original. It's not really scary, and the writing was very tired. I couldn't get really invested in the characters or the plot, and the book was very stagey and very, very dated. But the plot of The Second Coming, the second book I read by Richard Marsh, well, the plot of the book is also very unoriginal. It tells the story of the second coming of Jesus Christ, who suddenly appears in Victorian London. But what sets the book apart and makes it so fascinating and so surprising to me is the originality of thought or approach that Marsh takes. Again, as I mentioned, Richard Marsh is an adequate writer, but he is a searing thinker, as he takes the concept of the second coming and uses it to discuss and debate many issues, including organized religion, socialism, and corruption. And he deals with these issues with an intelligence and humanity that was startling to me. Again, here, his concept is unoriginal, but his treatment of that concept is very, very original. Another example is Henry James, whose novels of psychological drama and suspense all tread similar waters thematically, because James was always fascinated with class struggle, morality versus materialism, and the old versus the new. But the way he deals with these concepts, the way he reveals the inner workings of the minds and souls of his characters, their psychological struggles, their inner tortures, is always stunning. His take on his nondescript plots is always original in its approach, in its point of view. It's not the plots themselves that are original or new or fresh, but his take on them that made him such a groundbreaking writer, a genius, really. Look at what he did with the ghost story cliches and The Turn of the Screw, taking the main elements of the Gothic melodrama and the ghost story and producing what is arguably the most haunting and original ghost story ever written. A tale that Oscar Wilde called a most wonderful, lurid, poisonous little tale. So, originality is an ever-changing concept, and it's a concept that is hard to pin down. Since any work of art is a reaction to other art, there can never be a story that is called truly original. Since any new story will always be a reaction to another story that so thrilled, angered, or moved the writer that he or she was driven to write a story of their own in response or in reaction to that story that moved them or thrilled them so much that they had to write one of their own. All a writer can do is bring his original point of view, his own distinctive attitude to the telling of the tale. And that's how great stories are created. I'd like to end this episode with a poem by Robert Louis Stevenson called Windy Nights. This version is read by Mike Kaufman and is taken from the LibriVox website, and you can download this and many other poems, stories, and novels from the site. Thanks for listening, and please join me again on the Dark Fantastic podcast.
Whenever the moon and stars are set, whenever the wind is high, all night long in the dark and wet a man goes riding by. Late in the night when the fires are out, why does he gallop and gallop about? Whenever the trees are crying aloud and ships are tossed at sea, by on the highway low and loud, by at the gallop goes he. By at the gallop he goes, and then by he comes back at the gallop again.
You've been listening to the Dark Fantastic Podcast.
Flashes in the dark. Tiny stories. Vast dimensions. The Wait.
He waited for her in the usual place, just before sunrise. Would she come this time? This night? She had told him she wasn't there for him anymore. He knew it was true. But he still believed. And love after death.
Text copyright Ahmed Khalifa. 2021.